Welcome everybody to our ComAI lecture today, the last one for this semester, with a very special guest, Mirca Madianou from Goldsmiths College, University of London. Mirca Madianou, Goldsmiths College, University of London. I'm sure many of you know her because of her, long-term important work on media migration, digital infrastructures. So Mirca framed the concept of polymedia you possibly heard of. Besides that, she is involved in a new center at Goldsmiths College on the future of migration, which I think is also a very important institution, and recently published a book with the title Technocolonialism. This is somehow the background of our ComAI lecture today, and we are very proud to have Mirca here. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for the introduction and the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come back to Bremen and Zemke, and I'm always enthused, in my visits, here at Zemke, because there's always so much happening and so much activity and exciting research. So, and it's great to see the department and the center grow. So I'm going to talk about my book entitled Technocolonialism, When Technology for Good is Harmful. And I'm going to start with an example, which is the story with which the book begins, because it sets the tone for some of the issues I'm going to be discussing here today. So between 2017 and 2018, 1 million Rohingya refugees arrived in Bangladesh, fleeing genocide in Myanmar. In 2018, the United Nations Agency for Refugees, UNHCR, together with the Bangladesh government and a private contractor, organized a digital ID program, aiming to collect the biometric data of all refugees. You may know that biometric data, biometric readings have become sort of standard in the response to refugee flows. It's one of the first things that happens when a refugee comes into contact with UNHCR is to be asked to give their biometric data. And so this particular registration was controversial for a number of reasons, including the refugees' concern that the data could be shared with the government of Myanmar, thus endangering them in the future. And this concern led to protests in the camps, and then it led to strikes. And the Bangladesh government, which had been involved in this registration alongside UNHCR and the private contractor, so the Bangladesh government sent in the police who clashed with the protesters, and the next day, the biometric registrations continued as normal. Now, this example encapsulates both the pervasiveness of digital technologies in the humanitarian sector, but also the violence associated with these practices. With over 100 million displaced people globally, it's actually over 120 million people displaced globally, and 300 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, and the numbers keep going up every year, the humanitarian sector is facing significant challenges. As humanitarian emergencies and climate disasters become more common, digital technologies and artificial intelligence are championed as solutions for the challenges the sector is facing. Now, I mentioned biometric technologies, but these are not the only ones that are used in this context, right? We have algorithmic decision-making that is used in order to make decisions about who deserves to receive aid and who doesn't. We also have chatbots, which are rolled out to communicate with refugees. We also have other technologies like AI is being used to predict future crises and predict the flows of future refugee flows. I should say here that biometrics in and by itself, which biometrics have become ubiquitous in the sector, and since I started with biometrics, biometrics have a kind of a range of different uses, not just for the registration of refugees, but they're used to authenticate refugees in order to receive rations, in order to receive medical assistance, or other very basic services. So there is that kind of pervasiveness of biometric technologies, but then there are all the other innovations that I just mentioned. So, and a lot of these technologies are often kind of branded as technologies for good or AI for social good, to the extent that AI underpins some of these practices I just mentioned. Of course, AI for social good or tech for social good extends beyond humanitarianism, but a lot of those humanitarian kind of uses of technology would fall under that category. So the book really looks at these kinds of practices, and I've been, in order to make sense of them, I've been developing this term technocolonialism for a number of years now, and this is the title of the book. So the book draws on 10 years of fieldwork with humanitarian officers, with donors, with entrepreneurs, with digital developers, with communities affected by disaster or displacement themselves. And the book synthesizes really two separate projects. And through these projects, I have followed the trails of data from refugees to humanitarian organizations, to aid organizations, to tech companies, to donors. And I've really tried to map out the power relationships at stake. And I think this kind of following the trails of data is illuminating the power relationships at stake in this context. I'm not going to speak today about the two projects that I just said the book synthesizes, because I want to focus more on the argument, but of course I'm happy to expand later on in the discussion. So what is technocolonialism? So technocolonialism really refers to how digital innovation, data and AI practices entrench power relations and engender new forms of violence and create new inequities between what we call the global south and the global north. Technocolonialism illuminates the convergence of digital developments with market forces, state power, and humanitarian structures, of course, and the extent to which they reinvigorate colonial relations. So through the term technocolonialism, I recognize that phenomena like displacement, migration, humanitarianism, as well as technology itself, actually, are very much steeped in colonial relations. Let's look at humanitarianism, right? Humanitarianism is deeply entangled with colonial genealogies, colonial histories. It emerged in the period of colonial expansion in the 19th and 20th centuries. And although today we talk about humanitarianism in moral terms, this asymmetry between people in need and humanitarian officers and donors, of course, remains really at the heart of humanitarianism. And this asymmetry, which is, from the early days of 19th century, remains the same today, despite efforts to sort of reform the sector. So, we really see this reproduction of the social order of empire here. Now, technology and science are also part of colonial genealogies, right? Science was integral to the civilizing mission of colonialism, a tool used to justify colonial rule. And science was also the tool used to mold subjectivities through systems of classification. Of course, it wasn't just a tool in this context, it became constitutive of colonialism, right? And so an example here is biometrics, which emerged in the context of British Empire and again was used to classify subjects, the colonized. And I think we have to remember that AI is very much based on these systems of classification that have emerged in those previous the previous historical period. So AI is part of these larger genealogies of measurement, of enumeration, of classification that were originally developed by imperial powers to control colonial subjects. And it's, I think, no coincidence, as I said before, that biometrics was introduced in the context of the British Empire to control the colonized. And contemporary biometrics, which is a form of AI, it depends on AI to read physical characteristics. So it's not, I think, coincidence that biometrics today is also used to manage other bodies. So if you want any evidence of this colonial, the durability of colonial genealogies. Now, infrastructures, and this is a term I will return to later in my talk, also depend on colonial relations. And the typical example is the telegraph, right, which kind of mapped onto the geography of British Empire and later provided the footprint for the internet. So I really invite you here to think of colonialism as an ongoing structure of domination, right? An ongoing structure which helps explain how the legacies of colonialism persist and shape contemporary formations of class, of gender, and race, of course. It's important here to clarify that I'm not really referring to a single sovereign empire, but on an enduring structure of domination, which is evidenced in these persistent practices of othering, in the epistemic violence of Eurocentric systems, which are imposed on local cultures and invalidate local knowledge, and of course in the forms of racial discrimination, the codification of those forms. And this kind of, I'm really echoing Quijanó's work here on the coloniality of power. So let me be clear here. When I use the term colonialism, I don't use it to refer to a radically new phase of colonialism. I argue that colonialism and coloniality have never gone away. Empires collapsed, but their legacies and logics have survived and permeate processes like humanitarianism and technology itself. And technology then reworks the logics of humanitarianism and amplifies the inequities within them. Likewise, I don't use colonialism as a metaphor. I probably shouldn't even be saying this, but I feel I need to flag this. It wouldn't be appropriate to use colonialism as a metaphor. It wouldn't do justice to the term and the violence that it describes. It would depoliticize the term and the phenomena that it describes. But we need colonialism as a framework in order to explain why technological experiments take place in refugee camps, which are typically found in what we call the global south, right? We need colonialism as a framework to understand why there's no informed consent in a refugee camp, where to refuse to give your biometric data is to refuse to receive aid, when you have no alternatives for survival. And at the same time, I want to say that it's not really an argument about neocolonialism. So when I use technocolonialism, I'm not just saying this is a form of neocolonialism. Of course, neocolonialism is a cognate concept. But when I was trying to sort of develop a framework to understand, my immersion in the field of humanitarianism and the phenomena that I was encountering, I felt I needed a term that captured the active role that data, AI, and digital practices were engendering. A term that was capturing the consequences of these practices, rather, and the kind of things they were bringing to the surface. So to capture this active role, I felt technocolonialism was really an appropriate term, because it was really capturing this constitutive role of data and AI in reworking colonial legacies, especially in the context of humanitarianism, but actually also in international development, because the two fields are quite connected and the boundaries are blurred. And to be clear, technocolonialism is about violence. It's a form of structural violence, violence that affects particular groups of people. It's a form of indirect violence that affects groups on the basis of their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their class, their disability, or where they live in the world. But actually, technocolonialism is also often involves physical violence, as we saw in the example with which I started my talk. It wasn't, in that case, too far from state violence, just a step away. Incidentally, I feel I should share this with you. In 2021, I believe, it became known that the Bangladesh government did share the data of the Rohingya with the Myanmar government. So the refugees, when they were protesting, they were they were justified in being suspicious. And of course, this could potentially further, put people in further risk in the future. So we can already discern here the different actors involved, okay? On the one hand, we have humanitarian organizations, and here we could talk about the United Nations and the United Nations agencies, but we also have large NGOs that operate in different parts of the world. We also have nation states. And that's really important to remember the role of the nation state in this kind of framework of technocolonialism. So nation states act either as host nations, hosting refugee populations, for example, as we saw in the Rohingya example, the Bangladesh government was part of this. But also it's the role of donor states, the states that fund humanitarian organizations, which often make demands from humanitarian organizations in order to further their own securitization agendas, for example. And of course, then we have private companies which have entered the humanitarian space with great enthusiasm, and so they either form public-private partnerships with humanitarian organizations, or even act as humanitarian or quasi-humanitarian organizations in their own right through the development of their own sort of projects. So I think it's important here to say this, that when I talk about technocolonialism, I don't really mean digital capitalism. I'm not just talking about tech companies. I'm talking about this convergence between nation state or state power, humanitarian bureaucracies, market forces in the form of especially tech companies, and imaginaries around technology. And it's really this interaction that interests me. So I really want to say that I'm not just making an argument about the role of tech companies in humanitarianism, but it's how these different actors interact and produce this kind of these practices that I understand as technocolonial. So I've identified 6 logics which explain the push for digital technologies in humanitarian operations, and perhaps I should go through them briefly. These are the 6 logics. And I'll start with the logic of humanitarian accountability. And this is the logic which is the logic of humanitarian accountability is behind the assumption that the interactive nature of digital technologies will correct the deficiencies of humanitarianism and facilitate the participation of affected communities in their own recovery, right? We know that humanitarianism has been criticized for a long time. I'm not the first one to make this argument that humanitarianism is a form of colonialism and is very asymmetrical. So the interactive nature of digital technologies and also the advent of sort of datafication was seen by some as a form of optimism that, this is a way to democratize humanitarianism finally. And this optimism sort of pushed for some of these digital projects that we're discussing today. Now, on the other hand, we have the logic of audit. So if the logic of accountability started from this kind of recognition of the deficiencies of humanitarianism, the logic of audit emerged from this phenomenal success of the sector, which has grown exponentially in recent years. But as the sector has grown, the donor states demand evidence about the impact of their work, because of course they have to report back to their taxpayers, and so there is this push for sort of the collection of metrics, which can then be used as evidence back to donors, right? And this is another factor which explains why some of these technologies have been rolled out. For example, biometrics is often developed as a response to the donor's mantra, zero tolerance to fraud, right? And so NGOs develop sort of a biometric system to authenticate users and say, here we can show you that it's only the intended users who actually receive data and nobody else. So that's another factor that pushes the adoption of some of these technologies. And then, of course, we have the logic of capitalism, which explains the dynamic entry of the private sector in the humanitarian space through the now ubiquitous private-public partnerships, such as the one signed between Palantir and the World Food Programme. I'm sure you all know who Palantir are, but this is really, I just highlight this here because it is perhaps the most well-known of these partnerships, but there are thousands upon thousands of these. This is by no means sort of the exception. It is just the most well-known one. So this is becoming almost like the standard way of operating in the sector. And the idea that there can be technological fixes to complex social problems illustrates this logic of technological solutionism, which is my next logic. Solutionism puts solutions before problems. Really, the emphasis is not finding a solution, but it's really finding a problem for a solution. And this is really illustrated in this quote by one of my interlocutors from the aid sector, he's speaking now about the period of 2018 when blockchain was all the rage and everybody was going to these various industry events and you know, people were saying, I have this great, you know, new technology, new application, let's find a problem to test it, right? So instead of starting with a problem, understanding it, and then moving to the range of solutions and whether they need or not to be digital, it was starting from the technology, the solution, and finding a problem to attach to it. And of course, coupled with the logic of capitalism, the logic of solutionism really, I think, explains this experimentation that we're seeing in refugee camps and other humanitarian settings. Now, the penultimate logic is the logic of securitization, which at first glance primarily concerns the role of the state and the way it needs to make populations legible. But actually, it's not just about the logic of the state, because as I'm sure you know, securitization is big business. It's one of the most rapidly growing industries. So it's linked to capitalist logics. And in fact, all these logics intersect. What I'm trying here to do is create an analytical distinction. The whole purpose here is that all these logics intersect with one another all the time. But yeah, securitization is particularly relevant when we're talking about displacement and refugee populations. And as always, structures of control produce contestation. So the sixth logic is the logic of resistance. Now, this logic does not explain why these technologies are used in the humanitarian sector, but we cannot really understand the other logics unless we understand also resistance and what people do when faced with the structures of control. In fact, one could say also the structures of control exist because people resist, because people find ways, right? So it's really important to make sense of that too. And of course, colonialism has always been a struggle for resistance, right? And this can range from open-ended resistance, like the one I described at the beginning of my talk in the Bangladesh camps, but it can also take more muted forms of resistance, sort of through the micropolitics of everyday life. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that's my main focus in the book, sort of what I call mundane resistance, how people can resist below the radar in situations, especially where, you know, we have power asymmetries, and therefore, you know, to resist more openly would carry a great cost. So I've already said these distinctions are analytical. We have to see how they operate in tandem in order to rework colonial genealogies, which happen through a number of ways, you know, through extraction of data, which is one thing, but actually it's not just that. It's also extracting a value from experiments that take place in these settings. It's also about the epistemic violence, which occurs when we impose a Eurocentric system of knowledge in a local setting without really respecting the ways of doing things locally, through discrimination, which happens through this kind of the white machinic gaze onto another body, through this enchantment of technology. So I have a whole section in the book where I talk about how this enchantment of technology, you know, this belief that this technology can also has this almost magic qualities, like through a chatbot that answers your questions, that can amplify, augment the power asymmetries that already exist in humanitarianism, and of course this obliteration of accountability and the forms of infrastructural violence that I will hopefully be able to explain later in my talk. So these are the book chapters, and I can't talk about everything. So I'm going to talk about, you know, the book starts with, you know, the logics of digital humanitarianism that we've just discussed, and then I move on to discuss biometric infrastructures because they're so pervasive, and so it becomes this infrastructure that underpins so much else. And so I will talk about biometrics today, and then I talk about the extraction of data and the illusion of accountability, surreptitious experimentation. I'll say a few words about that. And then this notion of automating harm before I talk about resistance, which we will discuss today, and then finally infrastructural violence. So biometrics. I mean, just to show you how biometrics are ubiquitous, I'll take you to the refugee camp where I've been doing work over the last 18 months, which is a refugee camp at the border between Thailand and Myanmar. So think Western Thailand. And Karen refugees have crossed the border fleeing genocide. And so in this refugee camp, we can meet No Min, who is one of my interlocutors. And No Min will have to scan her face. So she has to use facial recognition in order to collect a kilo of rice. She has to scan her face in order to collect charcoal to cook this rice. She has to scan her iris in order to see a doctor or a nurse. And of course, she has to be part of other sort of standard registration systems also involving biometrics. So you can see this kind of encounter with the machine as a sort of everyday occurrence. It's not something like you do when you cross the border, but it's kind of this everyday interaction with the machine to kind of fulfill basic needs, right? So rather than being the perfect identification technology, as they're often described, biometric systems codify forms of discrimination. And this is something we know from the work of many scholars like Simone Brown, Shoshana Magnet, Ruha Benjamin and others. So biometric technologies privilege whiteness with significant higher margins of error when measuring or verifying othered bodies, whether that's in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, class, age, or disability. Now, an authentication error in a refugee camp can have devastating consequences because it means that you cannot receive something that's vital to you when you have no alternatives, right? So it's much more than a simple inconvenience. But there are many other deeper, as it were, consequences that take place here that concern me as well. So, for instance, when No Min cannot scan her face successfully, she cannot authenticate herself successfully, she tells me there's a problem with my face. In fact, No Min can never authenticate herself. She always has to call her husband, and in that case, his face is better recognized by the machine. But there are some people who are never able to do that. And so what really struck me was the language that people used, which was, there's a problem with my face, or there's an error with my face, or my face is not valid. And of course, there's nothing wrong with anybody's face. The problem is the machine, right? The glitch is systemic. It's part of the way this algorithm is coded to read white faces, male faces, better than othered faces, right? But you can really see here how people internalize the machine error as a form of inferiority that is their problem. And this is very much kind of reminiscent of Fanon's theory of epidermalization, right? Which is this kind of internalization of inferiority, which is the result of racism. And of course, Simone Brown talked about digital epidermalization, which is the imposition of race on the body through digital means. And for me, that is really one of the harms that we see in these biometric systems when they don't work. Even when they don't work, they produce something, and what they produce is race. Right? And so you can really see, because I said before, I understand colonialism as this ongoing structure of domination, evidenced in the persistent processes of othering, in the codification of racism. Here you see this codification of racism, right? You can also see the epistemic violence here, because interestingly, people in that part of the world, they don't typically have surnames. You would only have a name if you're Karen, and that would be typical also if you are Burmese. But the biometric system imposes a system of name, surname, like the Western system of doing things. It does not respect the fact that people may have multiple names, and that has been a way of coping in an area where there is civil conflict and civil war. And therefore, to have many names is a way of getting through surviving, basically. So there are many ways we can see this encounter with the machine as sort of reviving these colonial genealogies. And of course, there is no meaningful consent here, right? Because there's no way you could say no to this process. because to say no would be not to receive aid, right? And you can't really do that if you're trapped in a camp with no alternatives and no livelihood opportunities. Even if there is a consent tick box, like a consent to my data being used, that what meaning does that have if there is no way you can say I don't consent, you know? And therefore that becomes a sort of a fig leaf, that kind of, you know, a form of kind of saying that we would, you know, we've ticked that box that we have consent when we don't really have it in essence. So as biometrics underpins a range of essential practices, we begin to see that it challenges the nature of aid. And I think what we observe here is much more than a process of digitization or datafication, but actually a process of infrastructuring. That's how I make sense of it. And what do I mean by infrastructuring? I mean that by infrastructuring, I mean that there are these digital systems that underpin all aspects of, you know, humanitarian the operations, right? So food assistance depends on biometric authentication, you know, medical assistance depends on biometric authentication in this case. So it becomes then inseparable to think of the service without the delivery, which is, you know, biometric. And I think this is really important because it creates all sorts of issues for humanitarian organizations that have long prided themselves as being independent, right? If you have an infrastructure underneath the organization that is privately owned, how can you claim to be independent, which is supposed to be one of this kind of sacrosanct principles of humanitarianism? You know, how can you say that humanitarianism is independent if the database is interoperable with government databases, for instance? So there is this increasing porosity of humanitarianism, which, to be honest, humanitarian organizations have always been in conversations with nation states and organizations. But I think through these digital infrastructures, which become interoperable and underpin so much, we see this increasing porosity of the boundaries. And other principles are also challenged, because you could say, what about the principle of humanity, that you deserve to receive aid regardless of anything? But if you create a conditionality that to receive aid, you have to give your biometric data, again, you see a change in the nature of aid. So I think for me, this idea of infrastructuring is very key for making sense of these kind of practices that are taking place. And it's also kind of important for understanding experimentation, which I'll try to do briefly. So we hear often that refugee camps are treated as laboratories for experimentation, right? You know, there are pilots taking place, often sort of initiated by private companies in partnerships with humanitarian organizations. And in recent years, we have seen pilots involving sort of mental health chatbots, other kinds of chatbots. So I will say a few words about chatbots here, because that deserves attention as well. Now, we have to remember here that contemporary technological experimentation really mirrors the kind of geographic pattern, the geographic distribution of the medical and pharmacological experiments of the early 20th century. And this reveals sort of this persistence of the global geometries of power, and why people in the majority world are perceived to be ready sort of subjects for experimentation. So, you know, when I surveyed all AI applications in the humanitarian sector back in 2021, I found that there were 49 at that time. All of them were based in the US and Northern Europe, and none had, you know, been initiated by, you know, countries in Asia or Africa, and so on. Now, hackathons are one example of this kind of experimentation or practice. You know, as you know, hackathons are key sites for designing applications, and often these hackathons take place in the global north, as this particular hackathon took place in New York, and it was a hackathon that ended up designing this chatbot that was then rolled out in Africa, in Nigeria, and other countries actually. The World Food Programme Foodbot, which actually also operates in English. Yeah, so this was in Nigeria, but actually also in Kenya. So the question of language is very important here. I mean, the whole, what's really important when we talk about this geographic unevenness is that the geographies, where these technologies are produced really reflect the cultural values, of the producers, and this results in classifications, right, which again mirror these kinds of values and are embedded in the infrastructure. So they are invisible, even though, of course, they are, as I said before, dominant in the culture where they are produced. And this is really evident when we look at the question of language, which is so important in the topic of chatbots. Now, of course, we have different kinds of chatbots. You have informational chatbots that could be used just to give you information about where to go to receive aid. This is kind of an informational chatbot, or where to, where you can go to get asylum papers. But there could be educational chatbots, chatbots that help you learn skills or help you learn a language. And there are, of course, mental health chatbots, which are there to offer a form of psychotherapy when there are no real psychotherapists available to work with people in need. So I think the language in which chatbots operate is very crucial. And we know from the work of decolonial scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong that language constitutes the body of values through which we perceive ourselves and our place in the world. So even when a chatbot is translated in the local language, the classifications on which it is based will be very often reflecting Anglocentric or Eurocentric values. And I think this is particularly problematic in the case of mental health chatbots, right? Where cultural specificity is very, very important. Emotions, like the way mental health or mental illness is perceived and understood in different parts of the world varies widely. And postcolonial scholars have long criticized the kind of the classifications, psychiatric classifications for being Eurocentric. So producing a mental health chatbot to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder when refugees are in the trauma, right, I think speaks volumes about how far removed the makers of the chatbot are from the realities of people on the ground, right? We know that, trauma is a very different thing. We have to understand trauma much more long-term when you're dealing with situations like displacement. But when you're dealing with a top-down system that takes a Silicon Valley chatbot and imposes it in a war-torn context, or in Lebanon, you immediately see the problems emerge. And I think really this is an example for me of, this is not just an example of extraction, right? Yes, there is an extraction. Yes, the company that creates the chatbot receives publicity across different, high-profile outlets. But I think what's more important here is the epistemic violence of imposing a Eurocentric system in a local context, and especially in a fragile situation like, when we're talking about mental health and mental illness. So, so the harm of experimentation is really evidenced even more in what I call a surreptitious experimentation in the book. And I'll say a few words by that because I know we don't have a lot more time. But this type of experimentation is only possible because of what I said earlier about infrastructuring, right? Imagine you have this network of technologies underpinning all sorts of basic services, and this infrastructure operates in the background. It's not visible, but it underpins everything else. And so when experiments happen at this infrastructural level, they often become invisible. So this process of infrastructuring that I mentioned earlier allows for a continuous flow of experimentation, which is not named, it's not announced, and which operates at this infrastructural background and therefore remains hidden, but in plain sight, is still in plain sight. And in these circumstances, experiments become diffused without clear boundaries and without accountability, right? Surreptitious experiments take place without a formal announcement. So when an algorithmic system is introduced in a refugee camp in order to determine who deserves to receive aid and who doesn't, it's not announced as a pilot, as something that we will test out in order to decide whether to roll it out at a larger scale later on. It is basically just a new system, the new way in which things are done. So nobody is informed that there is a new system, these are the potential risks, do you want to opt out, do you want to opt in? It's just a new way of doing things. And that's what I mean that there is no announcement or informed consent. And this happens with many things, like a lot of the biometric systems I mentioned earlier are in that category. Similarly, algorithmic decision making is another example. And again, there is no consent because you can't opt out, because it's just simply the new system, right? And of course, there was always selective aid, right? Aid has always been selective because the needs across the world outstrip the supply. You know, there isn't enough money to help absolutely everyone. So humanitarian organizations have often made decisions about who deserves to receive aid and who doesn't. The difference today is that when this decision is made algorithmically, people on the ground do not understand why they have been selected, right? You don't know why and where do you go to say, this is wrong, my household has been excluded, but I want to complain. You really don't know. There is this opacity around how the algorithm works. And even frontline staff do not work. They work very hard. They don't really know, because frontline staff are also from the local communities typically. And often they are excluded from these processes, So it's not just people who receive aid, but actually the whole people who help them. So they cannot explain to the people they're helping why they have been excluded. They are also at a loss. And so there is this kind of sense of arbitrary exclusion, which kind of also brings me to this next term I want to share with you, which is this notion of infrastructural violence. Infrastructural violence is this kind of violence that people experience in a rather sort of ambient way, right? When they don't really know why they have suffered a form of exclusion or a form of harm due to the fact of this kind of infrastructuring that operates in the background. And infrastructural violence is a form of structural violence, right? I said, before, structural violence is an indirect form of violence that affects specific groups of people. Again, whether in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, class, and so on and so forth. So infrastructural violence is a form of structural violence, but it is even more indirect, or it's even more diffused than structural violence. It's even more diffused and more generalized, because you can't really pinpoint why why you're experiencing a particular form of exclusion or harm. It's the interoperability of data sets, and an error in one data set can be replicated in multiple other data sets that speak with each other, and therefore the errors can be replicated and affect people even after they have left camps. And again, I have examples to share, but I am aware of the time. So as digital and AI systems underpin all aspects of everyday life in the camp, their harms are generalized. And as infrastructures transcend institutional boundaries and humanitarian systems become interoperable with those of private companies and nation states, the opportunities for structural violence are multiplied. The shareability of data and the permanence of records amplify the risks to individuals. And as data infrastructures become more ubiquitous, the violence becomes more present and more diffused, almost like a form of ambient violence. So And these forms of infrastructural violence can be very spectacular, like when somebody's refused aid, when they feel they should be eligible. It could be when a machine refuses to recognize you when you don't understand why that's the case. But it's sometimes also the sort of daily humiliations of having to interact with a chatbot that doesn't include your problem in the drop-down list and having nowhere else to go to really seek help, or be given an e-voucher in an area that doesn't accept these kinds of systems, or has no cash points through which you can receive the money. So there are also these kinds of errors which are less spectacular, but still sort of a form of daily humiliation that people experience. Now, as always, oppression and violence are met with resistance, and I want to say a few words about resistance as I come to the end of the talk. And of course, colonialism has always been a struggle. It has always been a form of resistance. And I started my talk with an example of resistance, actually. But much contestation in these very asymmetrical settings happens in very muted ways, or sort of below the radar. And for me, kind of a challenge when writing the book was, how do I make sense of what is happening in the camps when it often sometimes doesn't even register as resistance, right? And for that, and there is actually a sort of a bias in the largely Anglo-centric literature on protest, which kind of favors open forms of resistance, protest, demonstrations, revolution. And of course, that's great and important. And even in camps it happens. You do have lots of examples of that. But often there is that kind of resistance below the radar. So how to make sense of that? And so I had to go to the Black radical tradition and read authors like Orlando Patterson and Cedric Robinson and Anton de Kom, in order to really understand how they had observed resistance when discussing slavery. And Robinson, for example, observed the very symmetrical settings such as slavery, where acts of outright defiance were not possible. I mean, the cost is prohibitive, right? But resistance took place through what he called passive forms. So he talked about passive resistance, including deliberate evasion, refusal to go to work, or satire. And I prefer the term mundane resistance, because there's nothing passive, of course, about about refusing to use a mental health chatbot or a feedback chatbot. It's a form of resistance in a different voice. And I should say, actually, very few people use that particular mental health chatbot that I talked about, but that is a separate story. So mundane resistance takes place below the radar through small, ordinary acts. So, as I said, refusal is a great example here. So even in my early research in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, where we were looking at the processes of disaster recovery and the uses of technology at that time, very few people were using the kind of digital forms of feedback that they were asked to participate in. They just didn't use them, and that I think spoke volumes about how valuable people thought they were. But it's not always possible to refuse. Just to return to the biometrics, if you're in a refugee camp, you can't just simply say, "Oh, I'm not going to give you my biometric data," because to refuse to give your biometric data is to refuse to receive aid when you have no other alternatives. So we have to remember that there are gradations here of agency and exclusion, and we have to really be aware of that, very much so. But we also encounter resistance in the everyday uses of platforms. So, for example, in the Typhoon Haiyan example in the Philippines, one platform that had been introduced was humanitarian radio. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is a platform that was it's a very top-down information dissemination platform with some form of sort of feedback mechanism, sort of for audit purposes. So and you have to remember, everything was completely destroyed. There were no media organizations left. There was no radio, no TV, no internet. Of course, there were no in the first few weeks and months after the typhoon made landfall. There were no newspapers. So humanitarian radio was there to provide information. This is where you go to get clean water. This is where you need to go and get tarpaulin to fix your tent. But there was a tour slot for music where the presenters would bring their guitar and play songs at the request of people in the community. And what I found when I looked at the feedback database, I was interested in the kind of digitized feedback databases. And I was just pleased to see that it's like 70% of the messages were requests for songs and not not serious. These were very serious messages. But that's a great example of how a platform can be appropriated in ways that are meaningful to the community. And this wasn't just a request for song, although that's also in and by itself hugely important. People craved that ordinariness that they had lost with the destruction of the typhoon, right? But they were also dedicating the songs to their loved ones, which was a way of rebuilding the bonds that had been, again, destroyed after so much death. Thousands of people died in that disaster. So just an example of how, people can appropriate platforms that are rolled out by humanitarians and tech companies in ways that are meaningful to them. So that's a great example, and I have many others also in the book. I want to end kind of also with something I'm doing in my current project. This is not in the book, but my current project, which is digital ID systems in a refugee camp. And we were trying also to work with our interlocutors, with our research co-producers, really, to understand what would be their ideal ID system from their point of view. And for that purpose, we used art in different forms, whether that was poetry or whether that was drawing, and people produced incredible work. And this work was so powerful that when we saw it, we decided that we had to really share it with the world. This is not just research data. So we've had 4 exhibitions to date, the first in the camp, then in Chiang Mai in an art gallery, then at Goldsmiths, which are the pictures here. And then finally, it's now in Bangkok at the University of Thammasat in the Museum of Anthropology. And it's going to be there until May. And it was a great way of people expressing again their agency through their work. So we can even think how research can be part of this form of resistance and a space of kind of giving people the opportunity to do something creative about the systems that they interact with. Now, I don't wish to suggest here that the onus is on people affected by disaster or displacement to reverse the harms of technocolonialism, right? The priority should be to abolish the conditions that lead to technocolonial interventions, and this is a wider political project. We need to remember also that people's agency does not cancel structural violence the same way that structural violence does not obliterate human agency. Both are true at the same time. Mundane resistance doesn't reverse the relations of power, but we cannot understand power without understanding forms of resistance. And unless we recognize people's agency, how can we ever hope for any social and political change to take place? Even though the micropolitics of everyday life do not reverse the power relations, they can plant the seeds for the decolonial struggle to come. So thank you very much.